Hello and welcome to the MBOM podcast, where you'll learn to master the business of yoga. MBOM is a proud part of the Wander Barn Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Amanda Kingsmith. I'm a 500-hour registered yoga teacher, a yoga business coach, and a total business geek. Here at MBOM, you'll learn everything you need to know to create a sustainable yoga business by learning from myself and guests from around the world about how they built their yoga businesses, and about how you too can become a successful yoga teacher, studio owner, and much more. All right, let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mastering the Business of Yoga. I am excited for today's episode of the show, and as always, I'm super grateful that you are joining me and tuning in for today's episode of the show. Today on the podcast, I am excited to be joined by Heather Ivany. Heather is a holistic practitioner and teacher of yoga, meditation, and Akashic reading. For over 20 years, she's led teacher trainings, mentorship programs, and retreats. And in this episode, Heather shares her background with yoga, meditation, and Akashic readings, and she shares how all of her practices have led her to teaching others, which is really, really beautiful and awesome to hear. She also shares what a sacred space is, how to set one up, the importance of having sacred habits in your life, as well as how to make time and space in your life for these habits that you want to create. And I think as yoga teachers, this is so important. I think we learn about this in teacher trainings. We know this conceptually, but sometimes it's hard to actually make time to set up an altar or to set up a sacred space or to understand how we can make any space sacred for our students. And then, of course, we want to have habits because that's what we're teaching our students, to build habits for themselves. And when life gets busy with kids and partners and jobs and all the things, it can be really easy to let your practices slip to the wayside, let your habits slip to the wayside, and to not use these beautiful spaces we're setting up. So we dive into that a little bit as well. So this episode is jam-packed with goodness. Heather was amazing to talk to, and I'm so excited to share this episode with you guys today. Before we get into it, I just want to give a little shout out to Offering Tree. Offering Tree is sponsoring this episode of the show. Make sure you go check them out, offeringtree.com/MBOM. They've recently launched some really cool features for studios. So if you're a studio owner in need of a software change or in need of a software in general, definitely go check them out. And if you're an independent yoga teacher who wants a one-stop shop for all things yoga business, Offering Tree's got your back. So once again, that's offeringtree.com/MBOM, and I'll tell you more about them later in the episode. For now, let's get to it. Here is Heather. Heather, welcome to the podcast today. I'm really excited to have you here with me.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. And I'm curious if you can share where you're joining me from today.
So I'm coming in from a small town in sort of a corner pocket of British Columbia. It's a mountain town with beautiful rivers and lakes, and it's most known for skiing. So it's called Fernie, BC, Canada. Yeah.
Yeah, my brother-in-law lives in Fernie, so I'm familiar.
Nice.
Yeah, he's lived there for a while. And actually, my brother's father-in-law lives there also.
Oh, wow. We can talk more about that later. That'd be fun.
Yeah, definitely. I love Fernie, though. Fernie's a beautiful pocket of the world. And for anyone who's like not familiar with small town Canada, I would definitely recommend a visit to Fernie, especially if you're in, the Calgary area and stuff like that. So awesome. Well, excited to dive in. I'm curious, let's just start with a little bit around your story, your background. Can you tell me a bit about how you got into yoga and meditation?
Sure. Yeah, they came into me a little bit separate. So meditation came in a little bit in my early years, but mostly it came in university. So I left home when I went to university. I went across the country to the East Coast. And I found the transition very challenging. I had this honeymoon stage initially, and then I realized how far away I was from home and the fact that I couldn't get back home anytime soon. It created a lot of anxiety within me. So I started a meditation practice, basically just listening to a guided recording that a therapist had given me, just to create a little bit more contentment within my matrix. And that sort of continued for the next couple of years. And then the asana practice of yoga came in a little bit sideways. I was a forest firefighter, and I had a lot of hours in the summertime hanging out by the machine waiting for a call, and you have to stay within a certain amount of meters of the helicopter. So I decided to self-teach myself out of a book. I got a book recommendation from a beautiful friend of mine, and I taught myself out of a book. And then that fall, I loved it so much, I enrolled into a teacher training program in Victoria, BC. And the funny thing is that I went into it very superficially. So I was thinking I wanted to have a career where I could be active. And I was a big step aerobics fan at the time. Like, this is way back in like the early 2000s when step aerobics was big. And I knew that wasn't something that could take me into my 50s. So I leaned into the yoga thinking it would be a type of career that I could do forever and ever. And it was only when I entered into the realm of teacher training that I learned and discovered that the physical practice amalgamated with the meditation that I was already doing. And it pulled in so many threads of my personal life that I was already entertaining, but I hadn't actually brought into an orb and knit together into its own little web that I could work with. So it was such a delight to see that all these parts of me could play together in the essence of yoga.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm curious, were you working like a corporate career at this point, or, what were you doing for work, and how did you kind of decide, hey, I want to transition into offering, yoga and meditation?
Yeah, I was a bit of a nomad. So I finished university, and then I did river guiding for a couple of years. So I traveled being a river guide into New Zealand. And then I came back and was doing forest firefighting. So I hadn't really entered into the career thing. I had a degree in kinesiology, but I hadn't applied it yet. And I just knew that the regular way of work wasn't for me, but I wasn't quite sure what I was meant to do. So I was dating a gentleman at the time who later became my husband, who just really encouraged this feminine, softer version of myself to lean into the yoga practice. And I'm forever grateful to him because it changed my life in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so nice to have a partner that like supports that journey. Because I think that in this world of like, you should do this and you should do this, and the next step in your, life path should be this. It's really nice to have somebody that supports, stepping away from that and doing something different.
Yeah, and what I loved was just the arena that I was in was so hardcore and intense. I mean, it was rock climbing and river guiding and faster and harder. And so all these chicks, like, yeah, I wouldn't even call them women. We were calling each other chicks. And there was like all the guys wanted to date a hardcore chick. So anytime that I was dating in that field, I was just really pulling my masculine energy forward to impress. And then I met this lovely, lovely man who was like, that's cool that you do all that stuff, but I'm seeing something else in there that wants to be seen. And why don't we see if you can give it a little bit of attention and see where it goes. His comment one day was, wearing pink shoes doesn't make you feminine, Heather. Because I had these pink and brown shoes that I was wearing. And so anyways, yeah, the rest is history, but it was a great intro to it.
Yeah, no, I love that. And so can you tell me a little bit about, your career journey, starting to dabble with like, okay, I've done these trainings, I have these practices, I'm starting to actually teach this myself?
Yeah. So I did my 200-hour in Victoria, and then I moved to Fernie, where, I mean, keep in mind, this is like over 20 some years ago. So yoga was not mainstream yet. It was not on every 7-Eleven corner kind of thing. So when I moved to Fernie, the only way that people were practicing yoga was there's one teacher that was taking over the upper level of a school in the evenings and teaching yoga classes out of one of the classrooms. And then there was like an art center where other teachers were doing kind of a collective donation-based yoga classes. And so I really wanted to make this a full-time gig. So what ended up happening was I moved with my husband to Kelowna, and the plan was to stay there. But when I got pregnant, I really didn't want to stay in a bigger hub for raising children. So when I moved back to Fernie, that's when one of the teachers in town had purchased a building. She was opening up a yoga studio. I started working with her, and instantly she asked me to join forces with her and start a yoga teacher training program. So I was teaching classes and doing a 200-hour training program pretty early on. And it's always kind of landed that way for me, like being a teacher of teachers. So I've done 500-hour teacher trainings and lots of continuing ed. And even now, as I've moved more into like a spiritual mentorship role, a lot of the people and clients that I work with today are spiritual entrepreneurs. They're the leaders in the industry, and I'm supporting them to augment and amplify what it is that they're doing.
Amazing. I love all of that. And I just think that that's a beautiful offering that you have. And I think that in this life and in this world, we really just need so much of that. And I want to talk more about that, but I'm really curious about kind of your background with Akashic Records and kind of how that piece comes into play with what you do.
Yeah, the Akashic Records has just been such a beautiful gift into my life. It was very unexpected. My situation was such that just sort of prior to COVID coming in, I was reaching a point with the asana teaching where I really was hungry to go deeper with people. And I wasn't quite sure how to step away from teaching classes and move into more depth. So when COVID hit and the studio shut down, it just gave me a beautiful opportunity to sit back and contemplate and have more time to meditate. And in that, it just sort of revealed to me that the yoga scene is very much handled. There's enough teachers that are teaching, and really good quality teachers, like not just teachers that are just, doing it as a side thing, but like people that are very invested in the practice. And so my calling was leaning me into offering more of a deeper container for people. So 3-month-long programs where people can really have opportunity for transformation. So the Akashic Records came in organically through meditation. I was directed and guided to reach out to an old family friend that I had bumped into a year prior, and I knew that she did the Akashic Records, but it was during the meditation where her name pinged back in. So that was sort of my indicator to book a session with her. And then from that session, it just became very clear that I was already subconsciously or unconsciously working with the Akashic Records. And if I could bring it more into a consciousness, things would start to really click for me. So I went through all the levels of the Akashic Records within a year. And then, interestingly enough, shortly after, I was teaching people how to access the records themselves. So I seem to just have this history of when I merge into a certain alignment with something, I get directed to go into teaching people that are meant to ripple this out even further.
That's so cool. I love that. And for anyone who's maybe kind of unfamiliar with Akashic Records, can you just give like a brief overview? I've had a reading before, so I'm familiar, but I'm imagining that there's probably people listening who are like, oh, what is this that they're talking about? Just since it's not like, it's very spiritual, right? But it's not something that we talk a lot about in the yoga world these days.
Yeah, it's actually like, it comes from spirit. I mean, the word Akasha is Sanskrit for spirit or space. But honestly, an Akashic Records session is very practical. So when I explain what the Akashic Records is, it's going to sound very etheric, but then I'll relate it into like why it's just such a beautiful practical tool to use. So everything is a form of energy. Energy has a frequency. So your particular soul that inhabits your body has a timeline or a blueprint. And so we call that the Akashic Records. So Akasha is the overarching umbrella of space. Think of it in science terms as the quantum field. And then your specific Akashic Records, the timeline of your soul, would be a frequency or a note or a tune within the orchestra of the Akashic field. so how it works is I simply tune in. It's like a radio dialing is a way that you can conceptualize it. So I have a mantra that I use that helps to open up your Akashic Records. And it has all the information of the history and the timeline of your soul, past, present, and future. And so if you can imagine, this is a lot of information. So there's certain energetic frequencies that distill this information so that when I'm having a session with someone, what is coming through me to relate to them is specific to the present moment, so that it's not a lot of noise and a lot of cacophony and a lot of things that don't make sense. It gets very beautifully distilled into present moment. So how people use this practically is some people will book a session personally because they feel like they're at a crossroads. They're not in alignment with what their purpose is in this lifetime. They want to be making the steps in that direction, and they're not sure what their purpose is. So we can go into and access their soul and find information as to what their purpose is and help to get them on track. Another practical way to use it, some people book a session for their business. So if they're feeling inert or stuck in their business, they'll book an Akashic Records session where we can go into the records of their business and see what's misaligned with them personally and clear out maybe some contracts, deals, agreements, belief systems that they have that they're holding on to that aren't serving them. And then we just attune and harmonize a little bit their personal soul with the consciousness of their business. And it goes on and on and on. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I did mine, I was able to ask, I can't remember, like 5 or 10 questions or something like that. And it could be around like any type of, category going on in my life and stuff. And I think it's just a very interesting and beautiful practice and a great way to kind of tune into yourself and start, working with your soul and working with your body, your mind, your energy, all of that type of thing. And I think it's really interesting that you were able to kind of blend this in with everything that you're doing and now be able to share this with other people.
Yeah, that's been like, just personally, as I started to align with the Akashic field and work with it, like co-create with it, that's where things just started to get really easeful for me. Financial abundance started to come in. The direction of my purpose became very clear. My next steps were constantly just being laid out for me without a lot of like weighing the pros and cons and all the rest of it. And then in the form of like my business, it's merged into 3 main programs. So if you want to align with your purpose and the specific reason why you're here right now, the program I have is Unlocking You. And then if you want to align with consciousness and be more connected to consciousness, I can teach you how to access the Akashic Records. And then when you have those 2 things working for you, most oftentimes people want to be in service to humanity. So the 3rd program I have is called Sovereign Leadership. And it's showing spiritual entrepreneurs how to amplify their business from working with the Akashic field rather than, and you still have on the sideline your like lead clicks and magnets and networking and all the things that you do logistically for your business. But this is accessing it more from the energetic realm, which is like so many of us spiritual entrepreneurs are trying to follow this business model that's shown to us through society, but we're spiritual workers, we're energetic healers. So using what is our superpower to augment our business just makes a lot of sense to me. And when I started doing this, it felt very much like home rather than me trying to put myself into a box that I don't really fit into.
I love that. Yeah. I felt like when this is sort of similar, but I felt like when I worked in corporate, it was very much like that. Like I described it as trying to fit into clothes that like were my size, but didn't really fit my body, if that makes sense. Like you put something on and you're like, it doesn't like not fit, but it's like, you don't put it on and feel like easeful in it. And I felt like that's very much how I felt working a corporate job. And I struggled with it a lot because on paper, it was very good. I had good benefits. It was a good opportunity. I was getting paid well for, the early years of being in my career. I had, good vacation. Everything was great on paper, but it just yeah, it's like, oh, this dress is beautiful, but it just is not right for me, you know?
Yeah. And what I love about, like there's a place where that fits. And I understand that my business requires certain things going on in the background. But what shifted for me is rather than me trying to make myself figure these things out and do this part of the business that really lights me up 0%, I now offload that. Like I outsource it. I have people that do that in the background. And this provides me more opportunity to be in the ethers and be clearing it out and calling in and working with the frequencies that are going to amplify my business. So it's like they're doing their thing on one side and I'm doing my thing on the other side. And it just creates this flourishing from the center in. So it is necessary. I agree with you. Like having benefits is great. I would love to have benefits, but it's something that I had to be willing to release in order to move into the freedom that I wanted from my business.
Very much in the same boat as you with that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I want to switch gears a little bit because I know one of the things that you can really help and support people with is, creating sacred spaces and also creating habits. And I think that for a lot of the people listening, this is something that is so important for us. And I think that as yoga teachers, we understand this, we know this, and some of us even do have, altar spaces or we support our students with that. But I think it's always great to just kind of dive into, how we can do this, why it's important, all of that good stuff. So I'm curious, maybe we can start with like for you in your life, your work, like how do you kind of define a sacred space or what is a sacred space to you?
I feel like there's two. Basically, it's a space that brings you into the higher frequency of yourself. I mean, in short form, that's how I would describe it. But this can also be physical and non-physical. So I can create a sacred space by walking in and feeling the energy of the room and asking if I want it to shift or adjust it before I have the offering that I want to be taking place in that space, whether it's with a group or with myself personally. And a sacred space is also very physical. It's a physical material form of an altar or just a room that you want to set up more feng shui in a sense. So that the room and the way that it's set up or the altar is set up, it invokes you into a space that it's designed to invoke you into. So if you're creating an altar as a memorial for someone that you love, then it's every time you pass by, there's the recognition of that individual. Or when you go and sit in that space, it's your opportunity to connect and come back home into their frequency. Now you can set up an altar also for just inspiration, right? So if your nature is more vibrant in nature, then I encourage you to bring nature into your home, especially if you live in colder climates where it's necessity to be inside more often for several months of the year than being outside. So this can be gems or crystals or rocks, little tokens that you pick up on memorable hikes or rivers or spaces that you've been to. And then perhaps you're complementing that with a picture image of some teacher or mentor or parent or caregiver that is inspiring that you would like to be more like in a sense. So that altar is creating the essence of inspiration for you.
All right, friends, we're just taking a quick break from the podcast to talk a little bit about Offering Tree. You guys have heard me talk about Offering Tree so much on the show, and that's because I truly love their business. And one of the things that I really love about Offering Tree for yoga teachers is that you can scale your business. You can create engaging digital content, video libraries, courses, challenges, and coaching programs that can meet your clients and students anywhere at any time. You can also plug seamlessly into your membership and packages to offer added value to your loyal clients. At any point, you can go from just offering classes to also offering courses, coaching, one-on-one privates, memberships, and so much more. And all of that is easy to do in one place. You don't have to look for other software. You don't have to pay other pricing plans and so much more. Plus, with templates and integrated website features, it's super easy to get everything you need for all of this stuff up and running and launched before you know it. So now when you have an idea for a new program or a new workshop or something like starting a membership, you can just make it happen with their services. So if this sounds interesting to you, head on over to offeringtree.com/MBOM. You can do a free trial here or get a discount for listening to the show. Once again, offeringtree.com/MBOM. All right, now back to the episode. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that that's a beautiful, beautiful place to start. I want to talk more about like the physical space, because I think that definitely being able to set that up in our homes is a great start with all of this. But you kind of mentioned, walking into a room, like say the yoga studio, and that can become the sacred space. So obviously, like when you walk into a yoga studio, there's a lot of things that the studio owner has likely done to kind of create this sort of sacredness in terms of maybe, plants or pictures or paintings, or just the way they have the props and the mat set up that kind of creates like, hey, we're here to come together, to breathe, to move. Yet I feel like as a teacher, it's kind of our responsibility to sort of like set the vibe, set the tone. How do you sort of, I guess, create this sacred space without those physical aspects?
Yeah, well, this is a great question because I've had to do this multiple times because I live in a town where I would teach in multiple different venues just to be able to fill my schedule. So I didn't always have the luxury of teaching in a pristine yoga studio. I've taught in gyms where there's like a spin class right before the yoga class. So the spin bikes get moved to the end. And then within 15 minutes, I have to transform that space into a calm, serene yoga environment. And even on retreats, right? Sometimes retreats are taking place in like hotel conference rooms or in areas that are athletic facilities, and they have a room designated for the yoga space. So I've taught in many different spaces. So this is a great question, and I love that you brought it up, Amanda. So the beauty of being in a yoga studio is that there's a resonance there in the room. So every time you have a group of people that practices, they're creating, think of it almost like a dust in the room. And so the repetition of the practice taking place in that room over and over and over again creates a residue or a resin in the space. So as the yoga teacher walks in, it's almost as if the space and the tone is already set before the class begins. So this is beautiful. It's like you're 80% there before the class starts. And yet we also have to keep it. So I will adjust. Like there's some studios where I prefer to teach from a different angle in the room because it feels more comfortable for me. So I've changed the direction in the room from which I teach from. In yoga studios, I've also adjusted temperature because sometimes a hot class is finishing and I need to open windows and just release out some of that tension of heat so that I can teach a more prenatal class. I've sometimes done a prenatal class right after a hot class, right? Other ways, and you can always adjust with your music. That's a beautiful way to set the tone, is just having your own music that brings you into the frequency you want to be in, so that as you're greeting people, they're able to feel that frequency, and they are getting an invitation to move into that frequency with you. And then when the class starts, I really take the time not to rush the tune-in. So everyone's coming from a different place. Some people are coming from work. Some people are coming from leaving a baby that's been crying all day long. Some people are coming from a beautiful romantic session with someone. Everyone is coming from a very different place. And so when all of this energy comes into a space, it's a little bit cacophony. So I allow time to just breathe and feel the temperament of the space that we're in. And I take the time to really consciously ground and release whatever it was that we were doing prior to being here, and allowing them to come into the presence of their body through breath, soft movement, sound, right? Letting them tune into the sound of my voice or the sound of the music, or even just the sounds that might be outside, the bird songs or the traffic down below, depending where you're teaching. So those are different ways that I'll sort of set the tone. And then what I love to do when I'm teaching is this is just sort of signature to me, and I'm by no means am I saying everyone has to do it, but I weave my body through practitioners as I'm teaching. So I really wander a lot through the room. And it's almost like, I picture it almost like smoke, like I'm allowing sort of the coattails of my energy to wrap around the people that are way back in the corners. And I'm merging them into the center. And the people that are in the center, I'm sending their energy out towards the far corners. So, and I do this consistently while I'm teaching. I'm moving around the room. I'm assisting and adjusting and talking and cueing, of course. But the intention for me is that by the end of the practice, there's a communal feeling amongst everyone that's there. And it just comes from just not just sharing my own energy, but also as I'm walking by someone, what can I sense and feel? And how can I language in such a way to either soften or augment that feeling and that sensation that's coming through that individual? So that's how I work with a yoga space that's already set up. And then if there's a space, like I said, like a gym that's like totally like a community center, someplace that's used for multiple different purposes, I arrive early as I can. I will even be there while I'll ask the teachers, like, is it okay if I'm doing a few things in the background while your students and clients are gathering their things and leaving? And usually that's not a problem. So I will start by softening the lights. That sends a signal to the people that are still in the room that we're now moving into a place of calm. I will shift the music. And then usually I'll come with, now this is very like personalized because I know a lot of people have challenges with smells. But if the space is really intense, sometimes I will smudge with sage. And give time for that smell to leave the room before the class starts. And sometimes I'll invoke with Palo Santo, and then sometimes I'll just use essential oils if that's allowed in the space. If none of these are allowed, if it's like a total scent-free environment, sometimes what I'll do is I'll go around and I'll clap. So I'll clap into the corners, I'll clap into the middle of the room. This just takes the stagnant energy and it drops it to the floor. This is why people applaud at the end of a performance, because it's cutting through something and it's bringing a higher vibration into the space. This is why applauding is the thing that we do at the end of something. So it not only cuts and drops what's not needed, but it also elevates and lifts up the energy that you want to be creating in the space. So that's just a fun thing to do. And then finally, I allow my own temperament. I just really tune into what is the feeling that I want to be emitting as people come in, and I allow myself to enter into that space.
Yeah, I love all of that. Thank you so much for going into so much detail with that, because I think that is so helpful for those of us who are teaching in like all sorts of spaces, whether you're outdoors or a gym, like you were saying. I was just perfectly imagining like, I've taught this as well. It's like, spin class wraps up, you move those bikes over, there's like puddles of sweat on the ground. It like doesn't smell the best. There's probably music pumping somewhere in the gym. And it's like, yeah, you got to work to kind of create that mood, that vibe, and kind of get people, out of their heads into their bodies. And it's hard. It's so much harder than if you just have the space kind of set up for you already. But I feel like all those tips are so amazing. And it's just a reminder that like we really can create these sacred spaces through so many ways that aren't, I guess, like the physical things.
Well, and I love that you even brought up like the puddles of sweat on the floor, because even the action of mopping or sweeping it's a cleansing and a clearing. Like this is why we clean our homes, is because this is why we spring clean and we clean our homes regularly and we clean our bodies regularly. We want to be cleansing what has been released so that we can bring in something new. So yeah, that's the last session's goop all over the floor. So even the action of sweeping, you can have intention when you're sweeping. I'm gathering all the residue of the energy that's been released, and I'm asking that as I sweep, that the fresh new current of this space comes in and it meets the people as they arrive. Like it's intentional sweeping. It sounds silly, but it's actual and it works.
Yeah, I love that. All right, I have another question for you about kind of unusual sacred spaces before maybe we go back to sort of, how to set up like altars, that type of thing. One of the things prior to having a baby this year was my husband and I were completely nomadic. So we were traveling pretty much full time, and we weren't in new places like, every day or even every week. We were staying a couple months. But one of the things that I really had to get creative with was these sacred spaces and just kind of utilizing small spaces as sacred spaces and having kind of a few key things to kind of, signify to myself, hey, this is my sacred space. So I wasn't able to have, a table with an altar with a number of different things on it because I had to be able to pack it up, keep it small. It can't take up too much room. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that type of situation. Like if anyone is, similar to me where they're moving around a lot, traveling, even how you do move your altar while traveling in temporary living, et cetera, et cetera. How do we kind of create this sacredness without it, I guess, being permanent or super big?
Great question. Yeah, same as you. I lived out of a van for several years, and then I had apartment dwellings and shared spaces with roommates and all the rest of it. So for many years, my altar was simply my mat. So don't underestimate just the power of a yoga mat being your altar. And what I still do to this day is I'm so there's a few different lines here. So altar is your physical space. Ritual is your habit and your routine that you do consistently to bring whatever it is that you're visualizing from the ethers into manifested form. It helps with that by having a physical representation of it. And then ceremony is also important. So it's there. I enjoy the ritual and the ceremony of rolling out my mat and rolling it back up when I'm done. And I still do this to this day, even though I live in a 900 square foot home with 5 people. So it's bigger than where I've lived before, but it's still a small space. So I very rarely will leave my mat out because I don't want my cat on it. I don't want my kids playing on it. This mat still goes everywhere. It's covered in dirt because I take it outside and do it in the garden. And so it's not like it's super clean and precious, but it's only used when I'm doing yoga, so that as I'm unrolling the mat, I'm using that as transition from whatever I've been doing prior to doing my practice. It's my breathing starts to change because my body knows where we're going. My temperament starts to calm down. Anything that's not needed starts to leave my mind. And so the action of just even changing outfits, Amanda, is huge. So I change my clothes when I do my practice at home. And then when I'm done my practice, I get out of those clothes and put my other clothes back on, even if I'm still changing from one pair of Lululemon pants to another pair of Lululemon pants. I just keep the whole space precious because I notice that that's what makes, for me, oftentimes a studio visit to a yoga class more profound sometimes than my home practice is these little things. If I'm going to the studio, I'm going to put on my yoga clothes. I'm going to carry my yoga mat. I take the time to take off my shoes and unroll the mat and lay on the mat. And all of this is prep to the space in the field that I want to move into. So I just transferred that into my home practice. And so, yeah, oftentimes the altar can just be your mat. It could be your mat in a couple blocks. It could be a candle. So in the evenings when my girls my husband worked out of town. So I always had to do the bedtime routine on my own, and my girls both wanted mom to put them to sleep. So many nights what I would do is I would lay them on the couch. There's a love seat and a couch in our living room, and I would put candles around my yoga mat and put on some soft music, and my daughters would fall asleep while I would be doing my practice. And all as my altar was the candles and the mat. And it just created this beautiful ambiance of sacred, intimate, ceremonial space.
Amazing. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I really love that. And I feel like that's, just a beautiful way for us to kind of create these small spaces. And I really love the act of unrolling the mat. And it's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking like, yeah, my altar space, my sacred spaces became my mat. If we had like the space in an Airbnb or a hotel room, I'll often find a space where I can kind of like leave it unrolled. But I've always really enjoyed, like you were saying, like the act of unrolling as well, because it kind of signals to my brain like, hey, we're getting ready to practice. We're getting ready to step into this place. And then also having a playlist has been, something that's been very helpful for me as well.
Yeah, music is huge. And sometimes I really enjoy my practice in silence. And sometimes I'm very aware, like my mind needs the music in order to enter in because it's just literally doing the to-do list while I'm going through the motions of the practice. So yeah, I use both music and no music.
Yeah, amazing. I love that. And so maybe let's switch gears and talk kind of about those like sort of more traditional altar spaces. I know you mentioned before, it can be like a table, you can have pieces of nature, especially if you live in colder areas. What other things can be, placed on your altar? How do you kind of, delegate that as your sacred space, sort of like we've talked about with the other spaces and all of that good stuff?
Yeah, so first, like give some contemplation and thought about what you're creating. So an altar is a place of a homecoming. It's beauty, it's inspiration. You might have several altars around your home that look very different from one another, or you might have one space. So this changed for me in the last year where I had one room in my house that was like my sort of yoga room, and all of my favorite things were in there. And then I realized I spend like 80% of my time in the kitchen because I got 3 kids and we're doing meals and packing lunches and all the rest of it. And why should the only place that feels lovely to me be the place that I get to for an hour a day? So I just started to make this conscientious effort to have mini altars around my home. So it starts to create sort of a heart opening, sacred opportunity in every moment of the day if you want to. So when you're creating your altar, you want to place things on it that bring you joy, that invite you to enter into a space of coherence, things that are special to you. So you might choose gifts from loved ones, from nature, from the animal kingdom. Oftentimes, birds will drop their feathers to bless humanity. You might have some crystals, maybe some resins, essential oils, candles, flowers, seeds, beautiful photos, arts and images, oracle cards, felted creations, homemade smudge sticks, anything that feels like it gives you joy and pleasure. And then you want to make it sacred. So sometimes people will color code their altars, so they'll choose like the color blue, and so everything that they're putting on that altar is blue. Sometimes I like to be guided by the seasons, so each time we come into a new season, I'm changing sort of the fabric that I'm laying on top of the table. And for me, my main altar is literally like a step stool, a wooden step stool that was one of my kids when they were trying to reach the sink to brush their teeth back in the early days. So I just take that and I cover it with like a little tablecloth that's seasonal. And then you want this to be a place of solace and magic that you can turn to as often as you need. So as the seasons turn, then you're changing your altar. You might change it with the equinox. You might change it a little bit with the full moons. You might not be really interested in that sort of a connection, and that's fine too. So sometimes people will put verses or prayers on their altar. You basically want to be thinking about what is the frequency that I want to be invoking in myself when I come into this space. And that's sort of your guideline as to what you're placing on this altar. If you are a private business owner, this is something that I do with each of my clients that I highly recommend. So I have, when I have certain clients that are considering working with me, I write their name on a little popsicle stick and I put it sort of just on the side so that when I'm sitting down at my desk, I'm reminding myself that I'm holding space for these people as they're choosing to work with me. And then when someone comes into a container with me with one of my programs, I transfer that popsicle stick to my altar so that every morning when I'm entering into my meditation space, I'm taking the time to feel into the frequency of my clients. I send them my blessings, and then I move into my meditation space. So that's something else that can just be nice for those of you that are soulpreneurs or entrepreneurs. And then the last piece is just so one is creating it. Second is you want it to be sacred. And then the third is to be intentional. So as you sit with your altar, tune into your intentions. Hand over what it is that you want to be releasing. Attune to the frequencies that you want to be harmonizing with. So if you're working with abundance, what is the frequency that represents abundance for you? It could be the frequency of money. It could be the frequency of Lakshmi. It could be the frequency of someone that you know that is just living such a beautiful, abundant life, and you're just bringing them in. You might want to be intentional by actually writing your intentions down and placing them on your altar so that you can connect with them and think of how you want to align and amplify. And then pour your love and your joy and your gratitude as you speak or you sing or you meditate, whatever it is that you're doing at this altar, and just really trust that there are amazing spiritual beings beyond your comprehension that have your back and they're working with you.
I love all of that. And yeah, I wanted to ask, once we've kind of created this space and set it up, how do we build habits around actually, using these spaces? So I feel like we can do, all the things. We can set up the space, we can unroll the mat, we can put the meditation cushion there, we can create the playlist, but like a huge part of it is that we actually have to show up for it, right? Like just creating this space is obviously very beautiful and intentional and can have a huge mindset shift. And I think for most of us, once we do that, we do want to use it. But I mean, life also happens, right? Like we're working, we're perhaps parenting, we're partners, there's so many demands on our time and energy. How do we actually create habits so that we show up in these spaces?
Great question. Yeah. And you're bringing out like a really good point. Like, I remember when my daughters were small, I had one daughter that loved to set up the dollhouse. That was how she played dolls, was setting up the dollhouse. And the other one just wanted to play with her Monster High dolls. Like she just wanted to play. So there are like two very different personalities here that I think we just need to recognize. Not everyone needs an altar or a space. They just want to do the thing. And so they're really good at getting on with the practice. And there's this other side of us that is really good at setting up the practice and doing so many hours setting up, but not actually practicing. So this is a great point that you're bringing up here. So the biggest thing that I think helps in this situation is your desire for whatever it is that you're wanting to create needs to be bigger than your resistance. So if you're desiring to have a yoga practice because this is what you do when you turn 21, you start doing yoga and you start, having this practice of yoga. That desire isn't very strong. It's not very rooted in a deep soil. So that when your resistance comes in of, oh, we're too busy, we're too tired. Well, I'd rather hang out with so-and-so. I haven't seen them in a while. I have this project I have to get finished. All the excuses that come in are going to be bigger than your desire. And so they're going to override it and thwart your beautiful intention of having a consistent practice. So take the time to really hone in on why is it that I want to be doing this particular practice? Why do I want to be meditating? Why do I want to be doing yoga? Why do I want to be having quiet cups of tea with my partner or looking my kids in their eyes? What is the reason for your wanting to create consistency with this? And let it go big. Let yourself visualize and amplify as much as you can with that desire. So the biggest reason why I moved from like meditating spontaneously to meditating consistently was because I didn't like how I was showing up in my family life. I was short-tempered. I had very little patience. I would snap. I sort of gave all my energy to my yoga students. And then when I came home, it was kind of a different side that was being presented in the home. So that desire to want to be in deeper relationship with my children and my husband became bigger than when the resistance would come in and say, oh, we're too tired or we don't have time. It'd be like, no, 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 no. This is so important to me that I hear you, resistance, but I'm just going to ask you to step to the side for a moment because we're doing this thing, even if it's clumsy and done half awake. I'm still doing it. And maybe it's 10 minutes rather than the 30 minutes that I wanted it to be, but I'm still going through the actual action pieces of fulfilling the consistency and the commitment that I have to it.
Thanks for sharing that. I really love that. And I think that there's so many good little nuggets to take away from that. But I really, really love the idea of like, sometimes we want, 60 minutes to practice yoga, or we want 30 minutes to meditate. And then when we don't have that, we don't do it. Yet I really like the idea of like, hey, but I have 5. Like, why don't I just meditate for 5 minutes? It doesn't have to be this like perfect practice, because 5 is better than doing none. Right. And like, what are you going to do in that 5 minutes? I mean, I'm not going to put this on anyone else, but if you're me, you're probably going to open Instagram and watch Instagram stories for 5 minutes. So it's like, wouldn't meditating for that 5 minutes be so much better? And it's like, I know this, and yet it's so hard in practice to do this, because I feel like we're so primed for like, I'm going to my yoga class, I'm going to my meditation class, I don't have enough time for this, blah, blah, blah. But I like the idea of just getting like little mini practices in.
Yeah. And what oftentimes happens is like you roll out the mat, your intention is to be there for 5 minutes. You start rolling around a little bit, and all of a sudden it's like 30 minutes has gone by and you're like, oh, I didn't realize 30 minutes have gone by, right? So that's the other thing, is that it can surprise you and overtake you in a way that you didn't expect, because you thought that your resistance was so big. So yeah, I love that. Just don't focus so much on the perfectionism of it. This is a neat little story that I'll share as we're closing here, Amanda, is and we just seem to be having a conversation that seems to theme around young kids for some reason. Maybe that's because we opened up with that conversation before we started, but
yeah, I feel like so much of my life is like revolving around a baby now too. So I feel like I've brought a lot of interviews recently, like, oh, kids, babies, just reflective of my current state.
Totally. Yeah, I remember that when my kids were small, that's where the conversations mostly were, for sure. So when my daughters were small, the time that I really had an uninterrupted amount of time to do my yoga would be when they went to sleep. And my kids actually fell asleep quite late. Like it would be like 9:00 or something when they went to bed. And oftentimes I would have this beautiful intention of like, I'm going to do this amazing flow class and all the rest of it. And then when I unrolled my mat and started my practice, honest to God, I basically just rolled around like a fish for 40 minutes because I was so tired. And I would feel absolutely replenished and like fulfilled. And yet my mind would guilt me because I hadn't done 10 sun salutations, or I hadn't done arm balances, or all the things that I thought my practice needed in order to stay strong as a teacher, right? And I went to a yoga conference in Colorado and took some workshops with Shiva Ray. And guess what the hell she asked us to do in the workshop? We rolled out our mats. We rolled around on the floor. We were like basically just it was an interpretive type of workshop that she was doing. And so she was asking us to follow the organic movements of our body, regardless of whether or not what we were doing looked like yoga or not. So here I am having this like experience where I'm like, I've just paid a lot of money for someone to give me permission to do what I'm already doing at home. And because Shiva Ray says it's okay, I'm now okay with doing it. And that was like a real game changer for me, Amanda, in giving myself the sovereign ability to be the leader of my own practice, and to not feel like in order for it to be authentic or good or whole or pure, it needs to look a certain way. And that was a total game changer for me. So when Shiva Ray said it was okay, it was totally okay for me to have my rolling around on the mat practice. But prior to that, there was this constant guilt and shame of not having it look like the performance that I wanted it to look like.
I can relate to this so much. I feel like now when people are like, ask me what my yoga practice looks like, I'm like, well, I move on my mat every day. I don't know if you would consider it yoga, but it's definitely like a movement practice because it's much more like intuitive movement, whatever I need. It's not sun salutations. It's not warriors, but it's whatever my body needs in the moment. So I think that that's a beautiful reminder. And it is so interesting how sometimes we feel like we do need that permission, right? And then somebody who is so renowned, so well known, like Shiva Ray tells you like, hey, this is what we're going to do. And then it's like, oh yeah, it's totally amazing that I'm doing this. So I love that. But in the same, I guess like the other hand, it's like, I would love if people out there can give themselves that permission, like we don't need it from somebody who's more advanced than us or more popular than us, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was like, that was what, like, so this was like 15 years ago. And it just changed my whole perspective in just like, I am the authority. I am the guru. I am the authority. And anytime I feel like I need to go, I still go external when there's some skill set that I don't quite have that I need to learn. Absolutely. But at the end of the day, nobody knows what's best for me other than me.
100%. Amazing. Well, there's so much more we could talk about, but I think now is a good place to wrap the conversation up. Can you share where people can go to find you, Heather?
Absolutely. So my website's very easy. It's my name, heatherivany.com. So HEATHER, I, V as in Victor, ANY.com. And on there, if people just want to connect with me with no strings attached, I have a 7-day spiritual reset on the homepage there. And it's just a beautiful 7-day journey that comes into your inbox with just tips and recommendations on how to move from the distraction of the periphery into the center of your core. And then all of my offerings and retreats and programs are all on my website there. And my Instagram handle is just my name, Heather, and then _ Ivany. And that also has some great information and tips on it. And I go live on there with some meditations about once a month that will be starting up again soon because I took the summer off to hang out.
Amazing. I love that. There's summer short in Canada, so you got to take advantage of it.
Oh
so I totally hear you there.
Yeah, don't blink.
Yeah, exactly. Or it'll be gone and it'll be snowing. Amazing. Well, we'll make sure that there's links for all of that in the show notes, and just want to give you a big thank you for coming on the show today. It's been such a treat to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me, Amanda. I know it's always challenging when you're taking a risk with someone that you haven't actually met before. So I appreciate you taking a risk with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Heather.
Take care.
All right, friends, I hope that you enjoyed that episode of the podcast with Heather Ivany. I hope you got some good takeaways from it. I know I immediately felt inspired to be utilizing my space a little bit better, to be setting up more spaces, and to just be diving into my habits. With motherhood over the last couple of months, it's been slow and steady, kind of getting back into my personal practices and figuring out how to do that when I've got a child who really needs me 24/7. So I felt re-inspired from this conversation, and I hope you did too. So make sure you go check out Heather. Of course, a huge thank you to Offering Tree for sponsoring this episode. Make sure you guys go check them out, give them some love, offeringtree.com/MBOM. And of course, thank you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part of this community. As always, I'm super grateful for you, and I will see you next week. Bye for now. Thank you so much for tuning in for this episode of the podcast. To find links, notes, resources, and everything mentioned in today and all episodes of the show, you can head on over to mbomyoga.com. You can find the podcast and myself on Facebook and social media at Mastering the Business of Yoga. And I would love for you to join the private Facebook community, Yoga Business Badasses. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please make sure you reach out to me at info@mbomyoga.com. And last of all, if you enjoyed this episode of the show, please make sure you hit subscribe and leave a review for the podcast. It would mean the world. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Namaste.